Good morning, friends. Welcome to Cliffnote Chronicles, where we bring you audiobook summaries of some of the world's best self-help and motivational books. An important update, friends. Over the past few days, I had been creating chapter-wise book summaries of romantic novels for you, as some of you may have seen and listened to. However, today, all of those videos suddenly received copyright strikes. 20 videos at the same time. Because of this, and in order to protect my channel, I had to delete all of those book summaries. For this, I sincerely apologize. From today onwards, we will focus exclusively on book summaries related to self-help, leadership, wealth creation, mindset, business, and communication skills. We will only bring you content that helps you grow and improve in these areas. And we begin this new direction with today's book summary, which is based on Trenton's book, The Art of Letting Go. One reason for choosing this book is that even I am feeling quite distressed today. A month of my hard work has been lost, and I'm feeling broken because of it. That is why The Art of Letting Go. Before we begin, let me ask you something, and don't answer out loud yet. Just notice what comes up inside. When was the last time your mind actually felt quiet? Not distracted, not numb, but quiet. Have you ever noticed how hard it is to let go, even when you know holding on is hurting you? Letting go of a conversation you replayed for the 100th time? Letting go of a mistake that happened years ago but still shows up like it pays rent in your head? Letting go of expectations, outcomes, people, versions of yourself you outgrew, but your mind didn't get the memo. What if the real problem isn't your life, but the way your mind refuses to unclench its grip? Welcome to the art of letting go. Now, let me ask you this. Do you crave emotional freedom but feel like your thoughts have you on a short leash? Do you ever wish you could stop overthinking, but the moment you try, your brain responds with, "Oh, you want quiet? Cool. Here's every embarrassing moment since 2009. Do you feel exhausted from fighting battles that exist only in your head? If so, you're not broken. You're human. And honestly, your brain is just doing what it learned to do: protect you, analyze, control, and rehearse everything that might go wrong even when nothing is happening. Here's a tough but freeing truth. Most of our stress doesn't come from what's happening. It comes from what we're holding on to. This book is about learning how to release that grip, gently, realistically, and without turning into a monk who lives on a mountain and drinks green tea all day. No offense to monks, they're doing great. But most of us have jobs, deadlines, families, notifications, and an inner critic who talks way too much. Speaking of that voice, have you ever noticed how your inner critic somehow knows exactly what to say to ruin your mood? It's never vague, it's specific. Oh, that sounded dumb. You should be further along by now. Why can everyone else handle life but you? And here's the weird part. We wouldn't let anyone else talk to us like that, but when it's our own voice, we treat it like it's telling the truth. This audiobook is not about silencing that voice forever. It's about learning how to stop believing everything it says. Let me ask you something else. How often do you judge your own thoughts? You judge yourself for being anxious. You judge yourself for being angry. You judge yourself for judging yourself, which is honestly impressive multitasking. That's where non-judgmental thinking comes in. Not pretending everything is fine, not forcing positivity, but learning how to observe your thoughts without turning every feeling into a verdict about who you are as a person. And what about self-compassion? Real self-compassion, not the Instagram quote version. The kind that says, "Yeah, this is hard, and I don't have to punish myself for struggling." Because here's the thing no one tells you growing up. Being hard on yourself doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you tired. This book also introduces a concept that can change the way you experience stress almost immediately: the dichotomy of control. In simple terms, it's the ability to separate what you can control from what you can't. Your effort? Yes. Your response? Yes. Other people's opinions? No. The past? Definitely not. The future? Also no, despite how much your mind insists on rehearsing it. Imagine how much mental energy you'd get back if you stopped arguing with reality. And then there's mindfulness, not the kind where you have to sit perfectly still and clear your mind, but the kind where you learn how to actually be present in your own life, where you're eating without scrolling, working without mentally time traveling, living without constantly narrating everything like it's a courtroom drama. This audiobook will also teach you self-distancing, a powerful skill that helps you step back from your emotions instead of drowning in them. It's the difference between "I am anxious" and "I'm noticing anxiety." One keeps you stuck, the other gives you space to breathe. And through all of this, we're building one core ability: resilience. Not the fake kind that says just be strong, but the real kind that allows you to bend without breaking, feel without collapsing, and move forward without dragging the past behind you like an overpacked suitcase. Here's some good news. You don't need to fix your entire life to feel better. You don't need to stop thinking forever. You don't need to become a completely different person. Sometimes, the most powerful change happens when you stop gripping so tightly and let yourself exhale. This audiobook is not about becoming emotionless. It's about becoming lighter. It's about learning how to release what no longer serves you: thoughts, stories, habits, expectations, without shame and without force. So as you listen, I invite you to do something simple but radical. Don't try to memorize everything. Don't try to improve yourself in one sitting. Just listen. Let the ideas land where they land. Let your mind wander and gently bring it back. And if at any moment you think, "Wow, this sounds like me," don't judge that either. Smile. That's awareness waking up. Because letting go isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And emotional freedom doesn't come from controlling life, it comes from learning when to loosen your grip. Take a breath. You're exactly where you need to be. Understanding letting go begins with a quiet but uncomfortable realization. Most of our emotional pain is not caused by what happens to us, when in reality, it does the opposite. Emotional attachment is not just about people or relationships. It is about the invisible strings we tie between our sense of self and how things are supposed to be. We attach to being right, being liked, being successful by a certain age, being seen a certain way, or having life unfold according to a mental script we never consciously agreed to, yet somehow treat as law. And when reality deviates from that script, the mind reacts as if something has gone terribly wrong, even when nothing objectively dangerous is happening. Think about how often stress shows up not because something bad happened, but because something didn't happen the way you wanted. A text message wasn't replied to quickly enough, a meeting didn't go as planned, someone misunderstood your intentions, or you replay a moment where you wish you had said something smarter, calmer, or more confident. The event itself is over in seconds, but the emotional attachment keeps it alive for hours, days, sometimes years. The mind keeps reopening the file, adding commentary, judgments, and alternate endings, as if emotional suffering were a subscription service you forgot to cancel. This is what emotional attachment really looks like in daily life, not dramatic heartbreak all the time, but a constant low-level mental gripping that drains energy, focus, and peace. At the core of this attachment is the illusion of control. Most of us grow up believing that if we think hard enough, plan enough, worry enough, or replay things enough, we can somehow manage life into behaving. Control feels safe. Control feels responsible. Control feels like adulthood. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Control works in very limited areas of life, and we tend to overextend it into places where it simply doesn't belong. You can control your effort, your choices, your values, and your response. You cannot control how others feel, how the past unfolded, how the future turns out, or how life surprises you. Yet the mind constantly tries to manage these uncontrollable areas, and that constant effort is exhausting. Letting go, in this sense, is not about becoming passive or careless. It is about recognizing where control ends and surrender begins. Surrender is often misunderstood as weakness, giving up, or losing standards, but real surrender is actually an act of clarity. It's the moment you stop arguing with reality. It's when you realize that fighting what already is doesn't change it, it only multiplies your suffering. Control says, "This shouldn't be happening." Surrender says, "This is happening. Now what?" One keeps you stuck in resistance, the other opens the door to intelligent action. You can see this clearly in everyday situations. Imagine being stuck in traffic while already running late. The car isn't moving, your heart rate is climbing, and your inner narrator is giving a TED talk about how unfair this is. None of that moves the traffic forward. The resistance adds stress without adding solutions. Surrender, on the other hand, doesn't mean liking the situation, it means acknowledging it without fighting it internally. The moment you stop resisting, the body relaxes, the mind clears, and suddenly you can think. Maybe you call ahead, maybe you breathe, maybe you accept being late instead of punishing yourself for something outside your control. Same situation, completely different experience. This is why resistance creates suffering. Pain is often unavoidable, but suffering happens when pain meets mental resistance. Resistance sounds like replaying the past, predicting the worst, blaming yourself endlessly, or insisting that life should have followed a different path. The mind treats resistance as problem-solving, but most of the time it's just emotional friction. It's like pushing against a door that clearly says pull. The harder you push, the more frustrated you get, even though the solution requires less force, not more. Another subtle form of resistance is clinging to identity. We attach to who we think we are supposed to be, the strong one, the successful one, the reliable one, the one who never messes up. When life challenges that identity, we resist not just the situation, but what it seems to say about us. A mistake becomes, "I'm a failure." A rejection becomes, "I'm not enough." Letting go here means separating events from identity. Something happened, it does not define you. You experienced discomfort, it does not mean you are broken. This distinction alone can reduce enormous emotional weight. Letting go also requires honesty. Sometimes we hold on because letting go feels like admitting defeat, wasted time, or misplaced hope. We think, if I let this go, then what was all that suffering for? But holding on doesn't give meaning to pain, it just extends it. Meaning comes from learning, adjusting, and choosing differently moving forward. Letting go is not erasing the past, it's refusing to let the past keep editing your present. There's also a quiet relief that comes with surrender that most people don't expect. When you stop trying to control everything, you don't become careless, you become more precise. You focus on what actually matters. You conserve emotional energy. You respond instead of react. And yes, sometimes surrender looks like doing nothing for a moment, which can feel terrifying in a culture that equates constant effort with worth. But stillness is not laziness, it's recalibration. If all of this sounds simple but difficult, that's because it is. Letting go is less about one dramatic decision and more about daily micro-choices. Noticing when you're gripping, noticing when you're resisting, and gently loosening your hold. It's choosing not to replay a thought one more time. It's deciding that peace is more valuable than being right. It's allowing life to be imperfect without making that imperfection mean something is wrong with you. Understanding letting go is understanding that freedom doesn't come from mastering life, it comes from mastering your relationship with it. And that relationship changes the moment you stop trying to force reality to match your expectations and instead learn how to meet reality with clarity, humility, and a little bit of humor about how seriously the mind takes itself. Because sometimes, the most liberating thing you can do is realize that you don't have to hold everything together. Life has been unfolding just fine without your constant supervision.
The idea of the dichotomy of control sounds fancy at first, like something you'd hear in a philosophy lecture or see printed on a poster next to a picture of a calm ocean. But at its core, it is one of the most practical mental tools you can use to reduce stress, overthinking, and emotional exhaustion in everyday life. The basic principle is simple but powerful. Some things are within your control, and some things are not. And most of our suffering comes from mixing those two up. We spend an incredible amount of mental energy trying to manage outcomes, people, and situations that are fundamentally outside our influence, while neglecting the few areas where our effort actually matters. What you can control is surprisingly limited, and that's not bad news. It's freeing news. You can control your choices, your effort, your values, your words, your boundaries, and how you respond internally to what happens. You cannot control how others feel, what they think of you, how quickly life unfolds, whether people meet your expectations, whether the past could have gone differently, or how the future will play out. Yet the mind constantly behaves as if worrying harder will somehow move these uncontrollable pieces into place. It's like yelling at the weather because it ruined your weekend plans. Emotionally satisfying for about 3 seconds, completely ineffective after that. This concept comes from Stoic philosophy, particularly thinkers like Epictetus, who lived centuries ago without Wi-Fi, email, or social media, yet somehow understood modern stress better than most of us. The Stoics believed that inner peace doesn't come from having life go your way, but from aligning your expectations with reality. They weren't emotionless robots, they were realists. They understood that life is unpredictable, people are imperfect, and control is often an illusion. Instead of fighting that, they focused on cultivating clarity and discipline over their own mind. In simple terms, they asked one question over and over again: is this under my control? If the answer was no, they practiced letting it go. If the answer was yes, they took responsibility and acted. This is where the relief begins. Imagine how much lighter life would feel if you stopped trying to control things that were never yours to manage in the first place. Think about work, for example. You can prepare well, show up on time, do quality work, communicate clearly, and act with integrity. You cannot control whether your boss is in a bad mood, whether your coworker misunderstands your tone, whether a project gets delayed, or whether a decision goes your way. When you confuse these categories, stress explodes. You replay emails, overanalyze meetings, and lie awake wondering how you were perceived. When you separate them, something shifts. You still care, but you stop torturing yourself over variables you don't own. Relationships are another area where the dichotomy of control can feel almost revolutionary. You can be honest, kind, consistent, and emotionally available. You cannot make someone love you, understand you perfectly, change their behavior, or meet you where they're unwilling to go. Yet many people spend years emotionally negotiating with reality, thinking, if I explain it one more time, if I say it differently, if I try harder, then they'll finally change. Sometimes they do, often they don't. Accepting this doesn't mean giving up on relationships. It means stopping the self-inflicted pain of trying to control someone else's inner world. The moment you accept that someone's reactions belong to them, not you, your nervous system finally gets a break. What makes this difficult is control feels like safety. Letting go feels risky. The mind says, if I don't worry about this, something bad will happen, even though worrying has never actually prevented disaster. The Stoics understood this trap well. They taught that peace comes from investing your energy where it can actually make a difference and practicing acceptance everywhere else. Acceptance is not approval. It doesn't mean you like the situation or agree with it. It simply means you stop fighting the fact that it exists. And that internal ceasefire is where emotional relief begins. You can feel this relief almost immediately when you apply the dichotomy of control in small moments. Picture being stuck in traffic, your jaw clenched, your thoughts racing, mentally rewriting the laws of physics so cars will move faster. The traffic does not care. But the moment you acknowledge, I cannot control this, your body softens. You still may be late, but now you're late without self-punishment. Or think about sending a message and waiting for a reply. You can control what you say and how you say it. You cannot control when or how someone responds. The suffering starts when you refresh the screen every 30 seconds and invent stories about what the silence means. Acceptance breaks that loop. Over time, practicing the dichotomy of control builds emotional resilience. You become less reactive because you stop taking responsibility for things that were never your job to manage. You become more confident because you focus on effort rather than outcome. You stop defining your worth by results you can't fully influence. Life doesn't suddenly become easy, but it becomes cleaner, less mental clutter, fewer imaginary battles, more presence. This approach also builds self-trust. When you stop trying to control everything, you learn that you can handle whatever comes next. That's the quiet strength underneath Stoic philosophy. It's not about predicting the future, it's about trusting yourself to respond wisely when the future arrives. And that trust, built slowly and imperfectly, is one of the most grounding feelings a person can experience. The dichotomy of control is not a one-time realization, it's a daily practice. You will forget it, you will catch yourself worrying about things you can't change. That's normal. The goal isn't perfection, it's awareness. Each time you notice the difference between what's yours to manage and what isn't, you reclaim a little more peace. And over time, that peace adds up. Not because life becomes controllable, but because you finally stop trying to control what never was.
Non-judgmental thinking sounds simple on the surface, almost too gentle to matter. But once you actually try to practice it, you realize how radical it really is. Because most of us don't just experience thoughts and emotions, we immediately judge them, label them, and then judge ourselves for having them in the first place. A thought pops up like, "I'm behind in life," and before you even realize it, your mind stamps it with "bad thought," escalates it into "something is wrong with me," and turns a passing mental event into an emotional crisis. Non-judgmental thinking is the skill of interrupting that automatic chain reaction, not by forcing positive thoughts or arguing with your mind, but by learning how to observe thoughts the way you'd observe clouds passing through the sky. Present, noticeable, but not in charge. When you observe a thought without a label, something subtle but powerful happens. Space appears. Instead of being inside the thought, you're looking at it. This shift alone can reduce anxiety dramatically because the mind often treats thoughts as facts, even when they're just old habits repeating themselves. For example, you wake up feeling unmotivated, and the thought, "I'm lazy," shows up. Judging that thought makes it heavier, more convincing, and more painful. Observing it without judgment sounds more like, "Interesting, my mind is offering the thought that I'm lazy this morning." That may sound awkward at first, but it separates your identity from the thought. You're no longer the thought, you're the awareness noticing it. And awareness, unlike thoughts, has breathing room. This practice is especially powerful when it comes to emotional reactions. Most emotional suffering isn't caused by the first emotion we feel. It's caused by the second wave of judgment that follows. You feel anxious, then judge yourself for being anxious. You feel angry, then criticize yourself for not being calmer. You feel sad, then tell yourself you should be over it by now. That second layer is where the pain multiplies. Non-judgmental thinking gently removes that layer. It doesn't make emotions disappear, but it stops them from spiraling. Anxiety becomes something you experience, not something you become. Anger becomes information, not a personality flaw. This is where people often misunderstand non-judgmental thinking and assume it means being passive or indifferent. It doesn't. You can notice a thought or emotion without judgment and still choose how to respond. In fact, that's the point. When you stop judging your internal experience, you gain clarity instead of losing control. Think about how much faster emotions move through you when you stop resisting them. The moment you stop arguing with yourself for feeling the way you do, the nervous system relaxes, and the emotion often softens on its own. It's ironic, but true. Acceptance speeds up healing more than force ever does. A lot of us also use judgment as a form of motivation, believing that being hard on ourselves will somehow push us to do better. In reality, it usually does the opposite. Self-judgment triggers defensiveness, avoidance, and shutdown. Compassion towards self, on the other hand, creates safety, and safety is what allows change to happen.
This doesn't mean letting yourself off the hook or lowering standards. It means approaching yourself the way you would approach a close friend who's struggling, with honesty, patience, and perspective. You wouldn't tell a friend, "You're a mess for feeling this way," so why is that language acceptable when it's directed inward? Practicing compassion toward yourself starts with noticing the tone of your inner voice. Is it supportive, or is it constantly pointing out flaws? Non-judgmental thinking invites you to soften that tone, not by replacing it with forced positivity, but by grounding it in reality. Instead of, "I always mess things up," it becomes, "That didn't go the way I hoped, and that's uncomfortable." Instead of, "I shouldn't feel this way," it becomes, "This is how I feel right now, and I can handle it." These small shifts may seem insignificant, but over time they rewire how you relate to yourself. One of the most freeing realizations that comes from this practice is that thoughts don't require action. Just because a thought appears doesn't mean you have to analyze it, believe it, or do something about it. The mind produces thoughts the way the stomach produces acid. It's a function, not a command center. When you stop judging thoughts as good or bad, they lose their urgency. They come and go more naturally. And you start to realize that peace isn't about having better thoughts, it's about having a better relationship with them. Non-judgmental thinking is not about becoming emotionally neutral or detached from life. It's about becoming less hostile towards your own inner world. When you stop fighting your thoughts and feelings, you conserve energy. You think more clearly. You respond instead of react. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to trust yourself again, not because you've eliminated discomfort, but because you've learned that you don't need to attack yourself for being human. That quiet self-respect is where real emotional freedom begins.
Self-distancing is one of those ideas that quietly changes everything once you really understand it, because it teaches you how to step out of the emotional storm without denying that the storm exists. Most of us don't just feel emotions, we become them. We don't say, "I'm experiencing anger." We say, "I am angry." And that small difference locks us inside the emotion like it's the only room available. Self-distancing is the skill of creating just enough space between you and what you're feeling so that you can breathe, think, and choose instead of reacting on autopilot. It's not emotional avoidance, and it's not suppression. It's perspective. When emotions are intense, the brain narrows its focus. Everything feels personal, urgent, and absolute. A mistake feels catastrophic. Criticism feels like rejection, and uncertainty feels like danger. Self-distancing interrupts that tunnel vision. It allows you to look at what's happening as if you were slightly outside the frame, observing rather than drowning. Instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" you begin asking, "What's happening here?" That shift alone changes the tone from self-attack to curiosity, and curiosity is far more useful than blame. One of the most effective ways to practice self-distancing is through language. The way you talk to yourself shapes how close or far you are from your experience. When you say, "I'm a failure," you're fused with the thought. When you say, "I'm noticing the thought that I failed," you've stepped back. It may sound subtle, even awkward at first, but it works because the brain responds to framing. You're no longer inside the problem, you're looking at it. And when you're looking at something instead of being it, you regain choice. This becomes incredibly useful in moments of stress. Think about a time when you were overwhelmed at work, staring at a screen, convinced you were behind and everyone else had it together. When you're emotionally fused, the situation feels like a personal verdict. When you self-distance, you can see it more objectively. There's a workload, there's pressure, there's fatigue, and there's a human being doing their best under imperfect conditions. The problem shifts from "what's wrong with me" to "what's the next reasonable step?" That's clarity, and clarity almost always leads to better decisions. Self-distancing also helps you stop turning temporary states into permanent identities. Feeling anxious doesn't mean you're an anxious person. Feeling unmotivated doesn't mean you're lazy. Feeling discouraged doesn't mean you're failing at life. These are experiences, not definitions. When you can step back and observe emotions as passing events, they lose their power to define you. You don't have to argue with them or push them away.
You just don't let them run the show. There's also a surprising emotional relief that comes with this practice. When you stop being consumed by emotions, you're not colder or less human, you're actually more compassionate. You can hold your experience with a steadier hand. It's like the difference between being trapped inside a movie and watching it from a few rows back. The story is still there, the feelings exist, but you're no longer overwhelmed by every scene. You see context, you see nuance, you see that this moment is part of a larger picture, not the whole thing. Another powerful aspect of self-distancing is how it improves problem-solving. When you're emotionally fused, the brain prioritizes protection over solutions. It wants to defend, justify, or escape. When you create mental space, the brain shifts into a more flexible mode. You start seeing options you couldn't see before. You might realize that a situation isn't as personal as it felt, or that a mistake is fixable, or that a conversation needs boundaries instead of more emotional energy. That space between stimulus and response is where growth lives. Mental space really does equal clarity. Without space, everything feels urgent and heavy. With space, things feel manageable. You don't need to solve your entire life, you just need to see the next step clearly. Self-distancing gives you that. It reminds you that you are not your worst thought, not your strongest emotion, and not this moment. You are the one noticing all of it. Over time, practicing self-distancing builds emotional resilience. You recover faster. You take things less personally. You stop spiraling as deeply because you recognize the early signs and step back sooner. And maybe most importantly, you develop a kinder relationship with yourself. You stop treating your inner world like an enemy that needs to be controlled and start treating it like a landscape that can be explored with patience and humor. Letting go through self-distancing isn't about disconnecting from life, it's about reconnecting with it more wisely. When you're no longer trapped inside every emotion, you're free to respond with intention. And that freedom, quiet and steady, changes how you move through the world.
The inner critic is one of the most familiar voices we carry, yet most people have never stopped to ask where it actually comes from or why it sounds so convincing. It doesn't appear out of nowhere, and it's not a sign that something is wrong with you. The inner critic is learned. It's shaped over time by early experiences, social conditioning, comparison, authority figures, cultural expectations, and moments when approval felt conditional. Somewhere along the way, your brain learned that being critical might keep you safe, accepted, or prepared. If you anticipate mistakes before they happen, maybe you won't be caught off guard. If you point out your flaws first, maybe no one else will. What started as a survival strategy slowly turned into an internal commentator that never seems to clock out. This voice often sounds like a mashup of past influences, teachers, parents, bosses, peers, or even society at large, filtered through your own fears. It repeats phrases you may have heard before, but now they feel personal. You should be doing better. Why can't you be more disciplined? Everyone else has this figured out. The reason it feels so real is because the brain doesn't distinguish much between an external voice and an internal one. When a thought shows up in your own voice, your nervous system treats it as truth, even when it's just a mental habit running on autopilot. The inner critic speaks confidently, urgently, and repeatedly, which gives it an authority it hasn't earned. Another reason the inner critic feels believable is because it often mixes truth with exaggeration. You may have made a mistake, procrastinated, or fallen short of a goal, and the inner critic grabs onto that grain of reality and builds a full-blown story around it. Instead of, "I made an error," it becomes, "I always mess things up." Instead of, "This is hard," it becomes, "I'm not cut out for this." The brain loves patterns, and the inner critic is excellent at turning isolated moments into sweeping conclusions about who you are. And because these conclusions are emotional rather than logical, they feel true, even when they're wildly unfair. What makes the inner critic especially powerful is its relationship with shame. Shame isn't just feeling bad about what you did, it's feeling bad about who you are. When the inner critic takes over, it shifts the focus from behavior to identity. You're no longer someone who struggled, you're someone who is flawed. And shame has a very predictable effect. It fuels avoidance. When you feel ashamed, you don't feel motivated, you feel exposed. So you pull back, you procrastinate, you distract yourself. You stop trying not because you don't care, but because trying feels emotionally dangerous. The inner critic then uses that avoidance as proof that it was right all along, creating a loop that's hard to break. This is why being harsh with yourself rarely leads to growth. It might produce short bursts of action driven by fear, but it doesn't create sustainable change. Fear-based motivation burns hot and fast, then collapses into exhaustion or self-sabotage. The inner critic promises improvement, but it delivers paralysis. It says it's trying to help, but it doesn't understand how humans actually learn and grow. Growth requires safety, curiosity, room to make mistakes without turning them into character assassinations. A lot of people worry that if they stop listening to their inner critic, they'll become lazy or complacent. In reality, the opposite is usually true. When the emotional threat is removed, the brain becomes more flexible. You're more willing to try, adjust, and learn. You don't have to waste energy defending your worth because your worth is no longer on trial. The inner critic thrives on pressure and perfectionism, but progress thrives on patience. Understanding the inner critic doesn't mean silencing it completely. That's not realistic. Thoughts will still arise. The shift comes when you stop treating that voice as an authority and start seeing it as a pattern, a habit, a reflex, something that can be acknowledged without being obeyed. You might notice it and think, there it is again, instead of, this must be true. That moment of recognition weakens its grip. When you replace shame with awareness, something changes. You stop avoiding yourself. You stop running from your own experience. And slowly, the inner critic loses its power, not because you fought it harder, but because you stopped letting it define you. Breaking the chains of negativity begins here, not by becoming perfect, but by becoming kinder, clearer, and more honest about how the mind works.
Perfectionism often disguises itself as ambition, discipline, or having high standards. But when you look closely at how it actually operates in daily life, you begin to see that it's less about excellence and more about fear. Fear of making mistakes, fear of being judged, fear of not being enough, fear of wasting effort on something that might not turn out perfectly. That fear quietly shifts perfectionism from a motivation tool into a paralysis mechanism. Instead of helping you move forward, it freezes you in place. You plan endlessly, overthink every detail, wait for the right time, and raise the bar so high that starting feels overwhelming. And then, ironically, nothing gets done, which perfectionism quickly uses as evidence that you failed. This paralysis happens because perfectionism ties your sense of worth to outcomes. If the result isn't flawless, it feels personal. A project isn't just a project, it's a referendum on your competence. A creative idea isn't just an experiment, it's proof of whether you're talented or not. Under that pressure, the brain shifts into self-protection mode. It delays, it distracts, it finds reasons not to begin. From the outside, it looks like procrastination. On the inside, it feels like being stuck between wanting to do well and being terrified of doing badly. Perfectionism tells you that mistakes are dangerous, when in reality, mistakes are how learning happens. This is where the shift to excellentism becomes so powerful. Excellentism is not about lowering standards or settling for mediocrity. It's about changing what you measure success by. Instead of asking, is this perfect? You ask, is this moving me forward? Instead of waiting until you feel ready, you begin where you are. Progress-focused thinking understands that improvement comes from action, not from endless preparation. It values iteration over illusion. You do the thing, learn from it, adjust, and do it again. That cycle creates momentum, and momentum builds confidence far more effectively than perfection ever could. When you focus on progress, the emotional stakes drop. A rough draft is allowed to be rough. A first attempt is allowed to be clumsy. You stop treating beginnings as final judgments. This mental shift frees up energy that was previously trapped in anxiety. Suddenly, starting feels lighter. You're no longer trying to impress an imaginary audience or meet an impossible internal standard. You're just trying to take the next reasonable step. And once you start, something interesting happens. The fear that felt enormous before action often shrinks during action. Excellentism also introduces a healthier relationship with effort. Instead of demanding flawless performance, it asks for honest engagement. Did you show up? Did you try? Did you learn something? These questions build resilience because they reward behaviors you can control. Perfectionism fixates on outcomes you can't fully predict, while excellentism keeps you grounded in the present moment. That grounding reduces overthinking and increases follow-through. A subtle but important part of this shift is giving yourself permission to be imperfect, not as a motivational slogan, but as a practical necessity. Imperfection isn't a flaw in the process, it is the process. Every skill you admire in others was built on countless imperfect attempts that you never saw. But perfectionism erases that reality and replaces it with a highlight reel that makes you feel behind before you've even begun. Permission to be imperfect is permission to learn in public, to adjust in real time, and keep going even when the outcome isn't ideal. There's also a surprising amount of humor in noticing how perfectionism operates. It promises satisfaction if you just meet its standards, yet those standards constantly move. The finish line is always 10 steps ahead. Excellentism notices this pattern and quietly steps off the treadmill. It chooses consistency over intensity, curiosity over self-criticism, and progress over performance. That choice doesn't make you less driven, it makes your drive sustainable. Over time, this shift changes how you experience work, creativity, and even relationships. You become more willing to speak up, try new things, and take risks because failure no longer feels like a character flaw. It feels like feedback, and feedback is useful. It points you toward growth instead of shame. Breaking the chains of negativity means recognizing that perfectionism isn't pushing you forward, it's holding you hostage. Excellentism, on the other hand, offers a quieter, steadier path, one where you're allowed to be human, learning as you go, building confidence through action, and discovering that real excellence isn't about never falling short, it's about continuing anyway. Practicing non-attachment doesn't mean becoming indifferent, detached, or emotionally unavailable. It means learning how to care deeply without letting outcomes define your worth or dictate your inner peace. Most of us don't just want things to go well, we need them to go well in order to feel okay about ourselves. We attach our emotional stability to results, how a conversation turns out, whether a project succeeds, how someone responds, whether our effort is recognized. Non-attachment begins when you notice how tightly your happiness is tied to outcomes you can't fully control, and you start loosening that grip. Not because you don't care, but because caring without clinging is healthier. Letting go of outcomes is one of the hardest mental shifts to make because the mind equates attachment with motivation. It says, if I don't care about the result, I won't try. But non-attachment isn't about not caring, it's about shifting where you invest your emotional energy. You still show up, you still put in effort, you still aim to do your best. The difference is that you stop tying your self-worth to whether things unfold exactly as planned. You focus on the process instead of obsessing over the finish line. And paradoxically, this often leads to better performance because anxiety no longer hijacks your focus. Think about how much mental strain comes from replaying outcomes after the fact. You send an email and then reread it 10 times, imagining how it might be interpreted. You finish a meeting and analyze every sentence you spoke. You post something and check for reactions as if they're a verdict on your value. That's attachment at work. Non-attachment says,
I did what I could with the information I had, and now I let it be. That release isn't passive, it's intentional. It's choosing not to drag your mind through scenarios that add no clarity and no peace. Emotional flexibility is what grows when you practice non-attachment. Instead of swinging between hope and disappointment, confidence and self-doubt, you develop a steadier inner baseline. You can feel excitement without desperation, disappointment without collapse, success without arrogance, and failure without shame. Emotions still arise, but they move through you instead of getting stuck. You recover faster because you're not interpreting every outcome as a statement about who you are. A big part of this practice involves detaching from identity-based thinking. Identity-based thinking turns experiences into labels. A setback becomes, "I'm a failure." A compliment becomes, "I'm finally enough." This creates emotional whiplash because your sense of self is constantly being validated or threatened by external events. Non-attachment invites you to separate what you do from who you are. You are not your job title, your productivity, your relationship status, or your latest success or mistake. Those are roles and moments, not your core identity. When you detach from identity-based thinking, feedback becomes information instead of an attack. You can listen, adjust, and grow without feeling exposed. You can try new things without needing them to prove anything. This is especially freeing in creative work and personal growth, where fear of judgment often blocks momentum. Non-attachment gives you permission to experiment. It says, "Let's see what happens," instead of "this has to work or else." There's also a quiet confidence that comes from this way of living. When you're less attached to outcomes, you become more present. You listen better. You respond more thoughtfully. You stop rushing moments because you're not constantly mentally negotiating the future. And yes, there's a bit of humor in realizing how much pressure we put on ourselves over things that in the long run won't matter nearly as much as we think they do in the moment. Practicing non-attachment doesn't mean you'll never feel disappointed or frustrated again. It means those feelings no longer define you or derail you. You allow them, learn from them, and move forward without carrying them like a badge of failure. Over time, this creates a lighter way of being. You engage fully, release gently, and trust that your value isn't something that needs to be earned through perfect outcomes. It's already there, steady and intact, regardless of how things turn out.
Curating your media and mental inputs might sound like a small lifestyle tweak, but in reality, it's one of the most powerful ways to break the chains of negativity, because the mind is constantly absorbing whatever it's exposed to, whether you realize it or not. Every headline, notification, comment section, and scroll session leaves a residue. And when most of that input is alarming, divisive, or comparison-driven, the nervous system never really gets a chance to stand down. The brain wasn't designed to process a non-stop stream of crisis updates and highlight reels, yet that's exactly what many of us feed it from the moment we wake up. News and social media are especially good at pulling us into negativity loops. The news is optimized for urgency, conflict, and worst-case scenarios because that's what keeps attention hooked. Social media adds another layer by quietly encouraging comparison. You scroll past achievements, opinions, arguments, and perfectly framed moments, and even when you know intellectually that it's curated, emotionally it still lands. The mind starts stitching together a story that the world is falling apart and everyone else is somehow ahead, better informed, or more put together. That story doesn't just stay on the screen, it follows you into your thoughts, your mood, and your interactions. Protecting mental space doesn't mean living in a bubble or pretending problems don't exist. It means recognizing that constant exposure doesn't equal being informed. Often, it just means being overstimulated. There's a difference between choosing when and how you engage with information and letting information choose for you. When you're always reacting to external input, your inner world becomes crowded. Anxiety rises, focus drops, and negativity starts to feel normal simply because it's familiar. Conscious consumption is the practice of being intentional about what you allow into your mind. Instead of asking what's new, you start asking what's useful, meaningful, or nourishing right now. This might mean limiting how often you check the news, unfollowing accounts that consistently trigger comparison or outrage, or noticing how certain content affects your mood long after you've put the phone down. It's not about strict rules, it's about awareness. If something consistently leaves you tense, drained, or cynical, that's information worth paying attention to. There's also a subtle sense of humor in realizing how much of our mental stress comes from information we didn't actually need. We open an app to relax and somehow end up emotionally invested in strangers arguing about things we can't influence. Conscious consumption gently interrupts that pattern. It creates space for quieter inputs, long-form ideas, meaningful conversations, creativity, and silence. And silence, as uncomfortable as it can feel at first, is often where clarity begins. When you protect your mental space, your inner critic has less fuel. You're not constantly comparing, reacting, or absorbing negativity, so your baseline mood stabilizes. You think more clearly, you feel more present, and you start responding to life instead of constantly bracing against it. Curating media isn't about control, it's about care. It's recognizing that your attention is valuable and finite, and where you place it shapes how you experience your life. Over time, conscious consumption becomes less of an effort and more of a habit. You naturally gravitate toward inputs that support calm, growth, and understanding. And as the noise quiets down, you realize something important. Peace isn't found by knowing everything that's happening everywhere. It's found by choosing again and again what kind of mental environment you want to live in.
Embracing change sounds inspiring in theory, but in real life, it often triggers one very specific reaction: discomfort. The mind loves certainty, routines, and predictability, not because they're exciting, but because they feel safe. Even when something isn't working, if it's familiar, the brain tends to cling to it. That's why people stay in jobs they've outgrown, relationships that no longer fit, or habits that quietly drain them. The fear of uncertainty is powerful because it asks us to step into the unknown without guarantees, and the brain would much rather stick with a known struggle than risk an unfamiliar outcome. Uncertainty feels threatening because the mind equates it with loss of control. When we don't know what's coming next, the imagination fills in the gaps, often with worst-case scenarios. Change becomes a story about everything that could go wrong instead of everything that could evolve. But this fear doesn't mean change is wrong. It means the nervous system is doing its job, trying to protect you. The problem isn't fear itself, it's letting fear make all the decisions. Growth begins when you acknowledge fear without allowing it to dictate your path. When you start seeing change as growth rather than disruption, your relationship with uncertainty shifts. Growth is rarely comfortable. It stretches you, exposes your edges, and asks you to let go of old versions of yourself. Think about any skill you've ever learned. At first, you were awkward, unsure, maybe even embarrassed. You didn't feel confident because confidence is built through repetition, not granted in advance. Life changes work the same way. You don't wait to feel ready. You feel ready because you started. Letting go of comfort zones is especially challenging because comfort zones aren't just about comfort, they're about identity. Who you are right now is partly shaped by what you're used to. When you change your environment, your habits, or your direction, it can feel like you're losing a part of yourself. But what's really happening is that you're making room for something new to develop. Comfort zones don't disappear when you leave them, they expand. What once felt intimidating eventually becomes familiar, and that's how growth compounds over time. There's also a subtle relief that comes with embracing change that most people don't expect. When you stop resisting change, you stop exhausting yourself trying to keep everything the same. You free up mental energy that was being spent on maintaining the status quo. Instead of asking, "How do I hold this together?" you start asking, "What's this teaching me?"
That shift turns challenges into teachers rather than threats. A growth mindset understands that change doesn't need to be dramatic to be meaningful. Small adjustments add up. Trying something new, speaking up when you normally wouldn't, setting a boundary, or letting go of a habit that no longer serves you, these are all acts of growth. They don't require a complete life overhaul, just a willingness to tolerate temporary discomfort in exchange for long-term clarity. There's also a bit of humor in realizing how often we resist change only to adapt anyway. We worry endlessly about transitions, and then, months later, we wonder why we were so stressed. The human mind is incredibly adaptable, even though it constantly forgets that fact. Embracing change is, in part, trusting your ability to figure things out as you go. You don't need a perfect plan, you need a flexible one. Letting go of comfort zones doesn't mean abandoning stability or acting recklessly. It means recognizing when comfort has turned into stagnation. It means choosing growth even when it feels awkward. Over time, this choice builds resilience. You become less afraid of uncertainty because you've survived it before. You learn that discomfort isn't a signal to stop, it's often a signal that something new is unfolding. Embracing change is ultimately about letting life move through you instead of fighting it. When you stop clinging to what was and open yourself to what could be, you discover that growth isn't something you force, it's something that happens naturally when you give yourself permission to evolve.
Brain dumping is one of those deceptively simple practices that sounds almost too easy to matter. Yet once you experience its effect, you realize how much mental energy you've been wasting carrying thoughts that were never meant to be stored long-term. Mental clutter builds up when ideas, worries, reminders, emotions, and unfinished thoughts pile up in your mind like open tabs in a browser you forgot to close. Individually, none of them feel overwhelming, but together they create constant background noise that makes it hard to focus, relax, or think clearly. The brain is great at generating thoughts, but it's terrible at holding on to them all without becoming tense and scattered. Most mental clutter comes from things that are unresolved, tasks you haven't started, conversations you haven't had, decisions you haven't made, emotions you haven't processed. The mind keeps resurfacing them, not to annoy you, but to remind you that something needs attention. The problem is that reminders don't turn into resolution when they stay in your head, they just loop. Brain dumping interrupts that loop by giving those thoughts a place to land outside of you. Writing as emotional release works because it shifts thoughts from the emotional centers of the brain into a more organized, logical space. When you write something down, you're no longer just feeling it, you're observing it. That act alone creates distance. You're not trying to sound smart or structured. In fact, the messier the better. Brain dumping isn't journaling with a purpose, it's unloading without censorship. You write what you're worried about, what you're avoiding, what's irritating you, what you're overthinking, and even the things that don't make sense yet. The page can handle it. Your mind doesn't have to anymore. There's often a moment of surprise when people try this for the first time. Thoughts that felt huge and tangled suddenly look smaller and more manageable when they're written down. Some of them lose their emotional charge altogether. Others reveal patterns you couldn't see before. You might notice that the same worry keeps showing up in different forms, or that half your stress comes from things that aren't actually urgent. Writing doesn't solve everything instantly, but it gives you a clearer map of what's going on internally. This practice is especially helpful when overthinking kicks in at the worst possible times, like late at night when your brain decides it's the perfect moment to review every unresolved issue in your life. Instead of mentally negotiating with your thoughts, brain dumping lets you say, "Note it." You write it down and give your brain permission to rest. It's a way of telling yourself that nothing is being ignored, it's just being handled in a calmer, more organized way. Creating space for clarity is the real goal here. When mental clutter decreases, decision-making improves. You stop reacting to everything at once and start prioritizing. You can see what actually matters and what's just noise. That clarity makes it easier to take action because you're no longer overwhelmed by everything you think you need to do.
You choose one thing, then the next, instead of trying to carry it all mentally. There's also a subtle emotional benefit to brain dumping that people don't always expect. It validates your experience. When you see your thoughts on paper, you realize you're not weak or disorganized. You're human. You have a lot going on. Writing becomes a form of self-respect, a way of acknowledging your internal world without judgment. And yes, there's a bit of humor in noticing how dramatic some thoughts sound once they're written down. That lightness helps break the spell of overthinking. Brain dumping isn't about finding perfect solutions or turning your notes into a productivity system, it's about release. You don't need to reread everything or organize it immediately. Sometimes the act of writing is enough. Over time, this habit trains your mind to trust that it doesn't need to hold on to everything. There's a place for it. And when your mind feels lighter, clarity naturally follows, not because you forced it, but because you finally gave your thoughts room to breathe. Negative self-scripts are the quiet, repetitive stories we tell ourselves about who we are, what we're capable of, and what we should expect from life. And most of the time, we don't even realize we're telling them. They run in the background like an old playlist you never chose but somehow memorized anyway. I'm not good at this. I always mess things up. I'm bad with people. Nothing ever works out for me. These aren't just thoughts, they're narratives, and narratives shape how we interpret every experience that follows. Once a script is in place, the mind starts looking for evidence to confirm it, quietly ignoring anything that contradicts it. These internal stories usually form early, often during moments when we didn't have the tools or perspective to question them. A few failures, a critical comment, a painful experience, and suddenly the brain decides it's cracked the code on who you are. The problem is that the brain loves shortcuts, and self-scripts are the ultimate shortcut. Instead of evaluating each situation on its own terms, the mind reaches for a familiar story and applies it automatically. That saves energy, but it also traps you in outdated conclusions that may no longer be true, if they ever were. What makes negative self-scripts so powerful is how closely they're tied to identity. The script doesn't say, "You struggled with this situation." It says, "This is who you are." That's a massive leap, and it's where a lot of unnecessary suffering begins. Identity-based thinking turns behaviors into labels. One awkward interaction becomes, "I'm socially bad." One missed goal becomes, "I'm a failure." One emotional moment becomes, "I'm too much." When identity is on the line, emotions intensify, defensiveness rises, and growth becomes harder because changing behavior feels like trying to change who you are. Separating identity from behavior is one of the most freeing mental shifts you can make. Behavior is specific, temporary, and adjustable. Identity is broad, complex, and not defined by any single moment. You can act in a way you don't like without being a bad person. You can struggle without being broken. When you stop fusing behavior with identity, feedback becomes useful instead of threatening. You can look at what happened, learn from it, and move forward without dragging your self-worth through the mud. Rewriting the narrative doesn't mean lying to yourself or replacing every negative thought with forced positivity. It means updating the story so it reflects reality more accurately. Instead of "I always fail," it becomes "I didn't get the result I wanted this time." Instead of "I'm terrible under pressure," it becomes "Pressure makes this harder for me, and I'm learning how to handle it better." These rewrites may sound small, but they change how the brain processes experience. They keep the story flexible instead of fixed. One helpful way to notice negative self-scripts is to pay attention to absolute language. Words like always, never, everyone, no one, and can't are strong indicators that a script is running. Life is rarely that rigid, but scripts are. When you catch yourself using that language, it's a cue to slow down and ask, is this a fact or is this a story I've been repeating? Often, it's the latter, and once you see it as a story, you're no longer trapped inside it. There's also a quiet humor in noticing how dramatic some self-scripts sound when you really listen to them. The mind can be a surprisingly intense narrator, turning minor setbacks into epic tragedies. Seeing that doesn't make you dismiss your feelings, it helps you hold them with a lighter grip. You're not mocking yourself, you're gaining perspective, and perspective is what allows change. Rewriting the narrative is an ongoing practice, not a one-time fix. Scripts don't disappear overnight. They weaken through repetition of a new, more balanced story. Each time you respond differently, notice nuance, or choose compassion over self-attack, you're editing the script. Over time, the old version loses credibility. It still shows up occasionally, but it no longer runs the show. Letting go through this process isn't about becoming someone else. It's about reclaiming who you already are beneath the noise of outdated stories. When you stop treating your thoughts as absolute truth and start treating them as interpretations, you create space. In that space, growth becomes possible. Not because you finally fixed yourself, but because you realized you were never the problem the story made you out to be.
Externalization, a core idea in narrative therapy, is one of the most freeing psychological strategies for letting go because it teaches you something your mind almost never does on its own. It separates who you are from what you're experiencing. Most people don't just have problems, they become the problem. Anxiety turns into, "I'm an anxious person." Procrastination becomes, "I'm lazy." Self-doubt becomes, "This is just who I am." Externalization gently breaks that fusion. It reminds you that thoughts, emotions, and patterns are experiences you're having, not identities you're stuck with. When you're fused with a problem, everything feels personal and permanent. The mind treats the issue like a character flaw rather than a temporary challenge. Externalization shifts that frame. Instead of saying, "I am anxious," you might say, "Anxiety is showing up today." That small language change creates psychological distance. You're no longer inside the problem, you're standing next to it, looking at it. And when you can look at something, you can work with it. When you are something, you feel trapped by it. Naming thoughts as events is a powerful part of this process. Thoughts often feel like facts because they arrive unannounced and speak with confidence. But a thought is not a command, a prophecy, or a verdict. It's an event in the mind, no different from a sound passing through the room. When you start labeling thoughts as, "My mind is offering the thought that," instead of, "This is true," their emotional charge weakens. You're not arguing with the thought, you're observing it. That observation alone restores choice. There's a reason this feels relieving. The brain is wired to protect identity. When a problem is framed as who you are, the nervous system goes into defense mode. Shame increases, flexibility decreases, and change feels threatening. When the problem is externalized, curiosity replaces defensiveness. You can ask questions instead of issuing judgments. When does this pattern show up? What triggers it? What helps it ease? Suddenly, the problem becomes something you can understand rather than something you need to hide from. This perspective also changes how you talk to yourself during difficult moments. Instead of attacking yourself for struggling, you might notice, "Self-doubt is being loud right now," or "Stress is trying to take over." There's a subtle humor in this, almost like watching an overdramatic character enter the scene. You don't dismiss the experience, but you don't let it dominate the entire story either. You recognize it as part of the narrative, not the narrator. Regaining control through perspective is one of the most practical benefits of externalization. Control doesn't come from forcing thoughts to disappear. It comes from choosing how much authority they have. When you see thoughts as events, you can decide whether to engage with them, question them, or let them pass. You stop reacting automatically. That pause between stimulus and response is where emotional freedom lives. This approach is especially helpful with recurring patterns that feel deeply ingrained. When you externalize a pattern, you stop seeing it as proof that you're broken and start seeing it as something learned. Learned patterns can be unlearned. They may take time and patience, but they are not permanent. That realization alone reduces hopelessness, which is often what keeps people stuck longer than the problem itself. Externalization also makes self-compassion more accessible.
It's easier to be kind to yourself when you're not treating your struggles as personal failures. You wouldn't attack a friend for having a difficult thought pattern, you'd support them while helping them navigate it. Externalization allows you to offer yourself that same support. You become an ally to yourself rather than a prosecutor. Letting go through this strategy doesn't mean distancing yourself from responsibility. You still take ownership of your actions and choices. The difference is that you're no longer carrying unnecessary shame. You're addressing the problem without becoming it. That distinction changes everything. Over time, practicing externalization reshapes how you experience challenges. Problems feel more manageable. Emotions feel less overwhelming. You develop confidence, not because life stops being difficult, but because you trust your ability to respond with clarity. You learn that you are bigger than any single thought, pattern, or emotion that passes through you. In the end, externalization is about reclaiming authorship of your story. You stop letting problems define the narrative and start seeing them as chapters that can be edited, understood, and eventually moved beyond. And that shift, from identity to perspective, is one of the most powerful ways to truly let go. Breaking free from toxic people is one of the most emotionally complicated parts of letting go. Not because it's unclear what hurts, but because it's often tangled up with loyalty, history, guilt, and the hope that things might eventually change. Toxicity doesn't always look dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it's subtle and slow, like feeling drained after every interaction, second-guessing yourself more around certain people, or constantly explaining your boundaries while they keep pretending not to understand them. The pain comes not just from what is said or done, but from how consistently your emotional needs are ignored or minimized. Emotional boundaries are the foundation of freedom here. A boundary is not a punishment and it's not a wall. It's a line that defines where you end and someone else begins. Without boundaries, other people's moods, expectations, and behaviors spill into your inner world, and you start managing emotions that were never yours to carry. Setting boundaries doesn't require confrontation every time. Sometimes it's a quiet decision about how much access someone has to your time, energy, and vulnerability. It might look like shorter conversations, fewer explanations, or choosing not to engage in certain topics. Boundaries aren't about controlling others. They're about protecting your own emotional space. One of the hardest parts of this process is detachment without guilt. Guilt shows up because many of us were taught that being a good person means being endlessly available, understanding, and forgiving, even at our own expense. But compassion without self-respect turns into self-abandonment. Detaching doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop sacrificing your well-being to maintain a connection that consistently harms you. You can wish someone well and still choose distance. You can love someone and recognize that closeness is no longer healthy. There's often a moment when you realize you've been working harder than the relationship itself. You're explaining, adjusting, hoping, and accommodating while the pattern stays the same. That realization can be painful, but it's also clarifying. It shows you where your energy has been going and invites you to redirect it. Detachment begins internally when you stop seeking validation or closure from someone who can't give it. You stop rehearsing conversations in your head, waiting for the apology that may never come, or trying to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. There's also a quiet humor in noticing how much effort we put into keeping toxic dynamics alive, like constantly watering a plant that refuses to grow. When you step back, you see that your peace improves not because the other person changed, but because you did. You stopped negotiating your worth. Breaking free doesn't always mean cutting people off completely. Sometimes it means redefining the relationship. Lower expectations, less emotional investment, clear limits. What matters is that you no longer allow the relationship to dictate how you feel about yourself. Letting go of toxic people creates space, and that space can feel uncomfortable at first, but over time it fills with calm, clarity, and healthier connections. You start to recognize what mutual respect feels like, and you realize that protecting your emotional health isn't selfish, it's necessary. Moving beyond the hurt means choosing yourself, not out of anger, but out of self-respect.
Forgiveness is often misunderstood because it's been framed as something you do for someone else, as if forgiving means excusing behavior, minimizing pain, or pretending that what happened didn't matter. And when forgiveness is presented that way, it naturally feels unfair and even insulting. But reframed properly, forgiveness has very little to do with the other person and everything to do with reclaiming your own emotional energy. It's not about saying what you did was okay. It's about saying, I'm done letting this hurt control my inner life. Forgiveness in this sense is an internal decision, not a moral endorsement. When you hold on to resentment, the mind believes it's protecting you, keeping the memory alive so the injury won't happen again. The problem is that resentment doesn't just preserve memory, it preserves emotion. You replay the event, the conversation, the betrayal, the disappointment, and every replay reactivates the same stress response in your body. The other person may have moved on, changed, or forgotten entirely, while you're still carrying the weight. Forgiveness for self is the moment you decide that your peace is more important than keeping the emotional wound open. This doesn't mean rushing the process or forcing yourself to feel something you don't. Forgiveness isn't a switch, it's a release that happens in layers. Sometimes it starts with simply acknowledging, "This hurt me more than I wanted to admit." Other times it begins with letting go of the fantasy that the past could have unfolded differently. Resentment often clings to the hope that replaying the story will somehow change the ending. Forgiveness gently closes that loop. It says, "This happened, and I'm choosing not to relive it anymore." There's also a surprising amount of freedom in forgiving yourself. Many people hold more anger toward themselves than toward anyone else. Anger for staying too long, trusting too much, ignoring red flags, or not speaking up sooner. Self-forgiveness means recognizing that you acted with the awareness and resources you had at the time. Hindsight is clear. Life rarely is. Releasing resentment toward yourself is an act of compassion, not denial. And yes, there's a quiet, almost ironic humor in realizing how much emotional labor resentment requires. It takes effort to stay angry. Forgiveness is lighter. It doesn't erase memory, but it removes the sting. When you let go of resentment, you don't lose your boundaries or your self-respect. You gain your present moment back. Forgiveness reframed is not about becoming soft or naive. It's about choosing not to carry what no longer serves you. When you forgive for yourself, you're not rewriting the past, you're freeing your future. Perspective taking is the quiet skill that allows pain to soften without being dismissed, because it doesn't ask you to deny what hurt, it asks you to look at it from a wider lens. When something painful happens, the mind naturally zooms all the way in. The moment becomes the center of the story, and everything else fades into the background. That narrow focus makes pain feel absolute and permanent, even when it isn't. Perspective taking gently widens the frame. It reminds you that this moment exists within a much larger context: your full life, your growth, your resilience, and your capacity to adapt. Seeing pain with wisdom doesn't mean minimizing it or pretending it was a blessing in disguise. It means acknowledging that hurt is part of being human, and that suffering increases when pain becomes the only story you tell about yourself. When you step back, you begin to notice layers. You might see that the pain revealed something important about your needs, your boundaries, or your values. You might realize that what hurt wasn't just the event, but the meaning you attached to it. That awareness doesn't erase the pain, but it changes your relationship with it. There's often a shift that happens when you ask different questions. Instead of, "Why did this happen to me?" you ask, "What is this experience shaping me to understand?" Instead of, "What did I lose?" you ask, "What did this show me?" These questions aren't about justification, they're about integration. Pain that isn't integrated lingers. Pain that's understood becomes part of your strength. Transforming hurt into growth doesn't require dramatic insights or sudden forgiveness. Sometimes it's as simple as recognizing that you survived something that once felt unbearable. That realization builds quiet confidence. You start trusting yourself more, not because life stopped hurting, but because you've learned you can move through hurt without losing yourself. Growth often shows up as deeper empathy, clearer boundaries, and a stronger sense of self. There's also a subtle humor in noticing how the mind treats pain like a permanent headline, when in reality, most chapters eventually turn. Perspective taking lets you smile gently at how intense everything felt in the moment, not because it wasn't real, but because you can now see beyond it. You're no longer inside the storm, you're looking back at it. Moving beyond the hurt doesn't mean forgetting, it means remembering without reliving. Perspective taking gives you that ability. It allows you to carry wisdom instead of resentment, clarity instead of bitterness. And over time, that shift turns painful experiences into quiet teachers, shaping you not through force, but through understanding. As we come to the end of The Art of Letting Go, what becomes clear is that letting go isn't a dramatic act or a single decision you make once and never revisit. It's a daily practice of choosing where your energy belongs. Control, when used wisely, helps you show up, try, and act with intention. But when it stretches beyond its limits, it turns into tension. And learning to release what was never yours to manage in the first place is one of the most practical forms of emotional freedom. Acceptance doesn't mean liking everything that happens or pretending it didn't hurt. It means stopping the internal argument with reality so your energy can be used for healing and movement instead of resistance. Compassion, especially toward yourself, is what keeps the process sustainable, because growth doesn't come from punishment or shame, it comes from feeling safe enough to learn, adjust, and keep going even when things don't go as planned. And perspective is what ties it all together, reminding you that no single moment, mistake, or emotion defines your entire story, even when it feels that way in the middle of it. There's a quiet humor in realizing how much time we spend holding on to thoughts, expectations, and outcomes as if they were fragile objects we're afraid to drop, when in reality, life keeps moving whether we grip tightly or not. Letting go doesn't make you careless, it makes you lighter. It gives you room to breathe, think clearly, and respond instead of react. The goal was never to eliminate pain or uncertainty, but to stop letting them run your inner world. When you practice letting go, you don't lose control of your life, you regain control of your experience of it. And that, more than anything, is where peace begins. As this audiobook comes to a close, it's worth remembering that letting go isn't something you master once and then move on from. It's something you return to every day, sometimes every hour. In small, ordinary moments when you notice yourself gripping a thought, replaying a conversation, or trying to control an outcome that hasn't even arrived yet. Letting go lives in those quiet choices. When you decide not to follow a thought down the same exhausting path, when you choose rest over rumination, or when you allow yourself to be human without turning it into a personal failure. Some days it will feel natural, other days it will feel clumsy. And that's not a setback. That's the practice working. Choosing peace doesn't mean life suddenly becomes calm or predictable. It means you stop demanding that it be. It means you give yourself permission to respond instead of react, to pause instead of push, and to trust that you don't need to carry everything at once. There's a strange kind of freedom in realizing that most of what you're worried about doesn't need to be solved right now. And some of it doesn't need to be solved at all. When you let go, you make space. And in that space, clarity and resilience tend to show up on their own. So, as you step back into your day, take this with you. You are allowed to loosen your grip. You are allowed to choose peace even when things are imperfect. And you are allowed to move forward without having everything figured out. If this audiobook helped you in any way, take a moment to like the video. Share it with someone who might need a little mental breathing room, and subscribe to Cliffnote Chronicles for more thoughtful summaries like this one. Until next time, take care of your mind and let yourself rest.